Hi, and welcome back to this tutorial series where we are going to go over the various settings within Fantasy Grounds Unity in relation to configuring a given campaign. Once a campaign name has been entered and the rule set itself has been selected, it's now safe to configure how users are going to connect to your campaign. And this takes us to the upper right section of the screen where the password and chat names are located up here. These options are going to be used to control who has access to your campaign, be it completely unrestricted or much more tightly controlled. As such, you have the usual password field, server type and server list features near the top right, and a public and private IPv4 and IPv6 based IPs down at the bottom, which I have blanked out, all of which are used to provide the information required for someone to be able to connect to a given campaign. I know I skipped over the chat name in that list, but it's simply used as a configuration box to set up the name your players will see in the chat window once Fantasy Grounds is loaded. And I'm not going to go cover that here, but I will cover it in the actual series where we deal with internally configured settings. The first selection I'm going to go over is the server type field, as it's going to be the most confusing part of the new networking functionality that Fantasy Grounds Unity has introduced when comparing it against Fantasy Grounds Classic. By default, the cloud option is going to be selected, and it's a new type of service that Smiteworks has introduced with the release of Fantasy Grounds Unity. And its intended purpose is to simplify the process of connecting players and DMs together. A little bit of history here is that Fantasy Grounds Classic was known to be very difficult to set up, as it did require some level of knowledge around being able to work with routers and firewalls, in order to be able to allow the players to connect to the Dungeon Master system. Smiteworks looked to change that by introducing lobby servers that would act as facilitators to determine the best method of linking a given player to the requested DM's campaign server. According to Moon Wizard, who is the lead developer of Fantasy Grounds and one of the owners of Smiteworks, the lobby server will first attempt to link each endpoint through the shortest possible route between the player and the Dungeon Master. If you're unsure what that means, essentially it means that a player's computer will attempt to connect directly to the DM's computer the first time, which is essentially equivalent to a LAN to LAN connection or an internet to internet based connection. However, if that's not possible to accomplish, it will attempt to automatically set up port forwarding so that when the players connect to the DM system, the router or firewall will see the requested traffic and allow the connection through. In order for that to work, however, the router or firewall that sits on the Dungeon Master's network must be able to support UPnP, or Universal Plug and Play. There are quite a few firewalls and routers that do support that functionality, but there are others that don't. And for those that do, the ability to forward that port is only functional while the Dungeon Master's own system is running Fantasy Grounds Unity. Once Fantasy Grounds Unity is closed, the request for that port forwarding expires, and the port itself gets blocked again. And that's how Universal Plug and Play works. The application requests from the upstream networking devices the ability to activate port forwarding. Once the application closes, it says, "I'm done, please remove that functionality." Essentially, this is the LAN connection type that Fantasy Grounds Classic used to use. However, in this particular case, it removes the requirement to manually manipulate the ports on the firewall. If, however, both of those connection attempts fail, you're now going to be in a position of last resort. What's going to happen here is the lobby server will hand off the connectivity to a relay service that is going to be handled by a third party. Through that, the DM and the player essentially become clients to that relay service. And yes, it is possible to have players connecting directly to your computer utilizing the LAN methodology and other players in the same campaign connecting through this relay service. Fantasy Grounds does have the capacity to handle both types of connections at the same time. But it can complicate things when you're attempting to figure out why one particular individual can't connect but all the others can. Unfortunately, there isn't an easy solution to that. If, however, you are more comfortable with the old methodology of linking your players into your campaign, then you can still make use of that by selecting the LAN-based type, and when you do so, you'll notice a change on the interface. This will require you to have enough understanding of how UDP traffic through your network is going to flow, and you'd have to ensure that the port you entered into the field where you see the default port here, which is 1802 on the screen, matches that port that you have chosen to open on the firewall. And this is one of the differences between Fantasy Grounds Classic over Fantasy Grounds Unity. Fantasy Grounds Classic used to use the TCP protocol when establishing that connection. Fantasy Grounds Unity makes use of the UDP protocol, so you have to make sure that you change that over if you've already got TCP traffic set up as allowed through, but don't have UDP traffic set up as being allowed through. By default, Fantasy Grounds Unity is going to use port 1802. You can modify this by simply putting in a different port, doesn't really much matter. However, this field is only able to be manipulated when you're actively using the LAN type. If you use the cloud-based type, it's always going to use 1802 or some random port that it has chosen for each connection. Only with this particular LAN setting do you manually get to control what that is. Now, if you've chosen to use this type of connection, you're essentially doing what the lobby server could have initially tried for you, but you're manually just going through the steps. Additionally, you will also need to give your players the IP address, specifically the external one if they are outside of your network, and the internal one if they are inside of your network, because the old 4-keyword alias system no longer works. As a Dungeon Master, I have used both methods without any major issues. In fact, I don't think I've ever run into any issues. But I also have an ISP that is extremely flexible when it comes to what I can do as a consumer. Other Dungeon Masters have consistently run into issues when attempting to connect players to their Fantasy Grounds Unity campaign, even though it was not the fault of Fantasy Grounds Unity itself. In those cases, it was primarily due to the much more restrictive ISPs that they're utilizing, and while various solutions were provided by Smiteworks to resolve them, there was little they could do because of that restrictiveness. For example, I personally ran into issues as a player, and after a random period of time, players, including myself, would begin to report to the Dungeon Master that there were issues loading images when the DM shared them over. After quite a bit of debugging and testing, which included things like resetting the campaign, having the players reset their entire cache, going through and recreating the campaign and disabling all the extensions in play and reducing the number of modules that were loaded, even opening up issues with Smiteworks, the issue just never seemed to go away. Eventually, it was determined that the Dungeon Master had to run a VPN service, specifically paying for one as opposed to using the free one that they were using at the time, in order for things to function properly, which is highly unfortunate. This fact came about when we realized that their ISP was being very restrictive on the types of traffic that were being sent to and from their DM's network. So there was not really much anybody could do, and there wasn't a solution that Smiteworks could come up to figure out how to work around this problem. The VPN service was the only option. And I hope that will help you figure out what might be going on in your particular system if you're running into a very similar situation. So let's return to the cloud server type, because that's going to re-enable the server list options that I'm now going to explain here. The server list option allows you to set it up so that your campaign is either publicly listed on the server lobby or kept private. But this is only going to pertain to the cloud server selection, and it is not going to be applicable to the LAN server type, much like the port isn't applicable to the cloud server type. When you list your campaign in the lobby, it's done so that others can see it. You can still protect who is able to connect to it by ensuring that a password is set. This does, however, mean that anyone can see what campaign it is that you're running, even if they can't connect to it, and they will also know that you're currently online. Now, I mention that because I do know a couple of Dungeon Masters who've essentially been stalked by bad players, meaning that the player joined their campaign, it was determined that they really weren't the right fit for that particular campaign and they were asked to leave, but they really kept trying to get back into the campaign to the point where they were essentially stalking the Dungeon Master. Now, 98% of the population probably isn't going to be like that, so it's really only a small percentage of the players that will actively do that. Now, as I have stated, if you prefer to have better control over your visibility online, then you'll want to select the private listing, as the only service that will know you're online is the lobby service itself, not your players. It won't list your campaign in the lobby, and you don't have to choose a password for those players to connect with, although I do recommend doing it because it is going to manage to prevent players from connecting, even if they somehow manage to figure out that you're online and you're running a campaign. But again, that comes back to a particular player who wasn't necessarily a good fit, and now they're trying to ruin it because you've kicked them out. Now, I do explain how to connect to those kinds of campaigns in another video, which I'll try to remember to link the video in this description below. But you will have to provide your players the GM name to look for in order for them to be able to actually search for the campaign, as well as the password that you have set in order for them to be able to connect to the campaign. Now, if you've started out with your campaign being listed public initially, and you decide to take it private, that won't break the campaign, but it might trigger some additional updates on the player side, as they might have to re-enter their password, as well as potentially relink their characters. And this is simply because of how Fantasy Grounds maps things to a given player when they're connected. I don't think that's going to be a problem because I've only ever used a private listing, but let me know in the comments below if you've run into that situation. Now, regardless of whether your players were connecting to your campaign through a public listing or a private listing, once they've connected, that connection is going to remain in their connection history unless they manually delete it. So they should be able to connect to your campaign again without further issues and or without even having to re-enter your password because it's saved. The only time a password would have to be re-entered is if you changed it for some reason. Now, circling back to the password field, which we've kind of already more or less covered, the password is going to be used to control who has access to your campaign, and that's its only purpose. I highly recommend that you use passwords that are at least 12 characters or more, simply for safety, as you are essentially exposing your system to the internet, so it's best to ensure some level of security is kept in mind. I'm not exactly sure of the exact limit for that particular password field, but I have used characters that have been as long as 32 characters or as short as 12 for any of my campaigns, just to ensure that I'm protecting my players from bad actors as best I can. The password itself is going to be displayed in plain text, and it doesn't matter whether you're simply creating the campaign or whether you're loading the campaign, that password will always be displayed to you in plain text. It will not be blanked out. And that's most likely because most campaigns are run either once a week or once a month or whatever your frequency happens to be, so you're not always going to remember what that password is unless you've saved it somewhere else. So for this purpose, it's displayed in plain text. Changing the password after the fact will require your players to re-enter the password. But once they've connected once with that newly changed password, they won't have to enter that password again until you change it again. But changing that password has zero impact on anything else in relation to the campaign itself, in relation to a player. So simply changing the password just simply forces them to re-enter it. Once they're connected, they still have access to their characters, any notes that they've set up, and anything else that they've gone through the process of creating that might be linked to that particular campaign. However, that does bring us to the end of this particular topic, so let's move on to the next one.